He walks to work, the King County Courthouse. He's the director of communications for the prosecutor's office. He tells us about the cruel things that human beings do to one another in a sometimes cruel world. That's what Casey McNerthney does, but it's not who he is. To understand that, you should know a story.
I remember just being so excited with my parents, and it was just a fun time.
In 1985, his parents took him to see Mr. Rogers live at the Paramount Theater. There he was, on the stage, in the flesh. That's Casey with his mom that day.
There's only one in this wonderful world. You are special.
When you're not that cool kid in grade school or middle school or even in preschool, you know, having somebody to say, hey, you're all right, you're okay just the way you are, that resonates.
Maybe this helps explain the connection. As a child, and even sometimes now, Casey has battled a tendency to stutter.
Yeah, I think it was the worst in kindergarten, first grade, through about freshman year of high school. Freshman, sophomore year of high school, it was really tough. There was, you know, and kids are pretty rough.
But Casey has a certain quality about him, a true blue purity that others are drawn to. He went on with the business of becoming a young man. And as a freshman in college, he and this guy, Morgan Marshall, his best buddy, wanted to take a road trip.
Casey came up with the idea, and as soon as I heard it, I was like, I'm in.
That sounded like a wild idea, and I thought, all right, well, let's try it out.
Oh, it's Mr. McFeely. Speedy delivery. That is.
Do you remember this character, Mr. McFeely, the postman in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood? His real name is David Newell. Casey sent David an email.
And they wanted to drive across country and meet Fred Rogers.
And so they climbed into Morgan's '87 Ford Aerostar van and took off to see America.
Why weren't you too cool for Fred Rogers?
Almost every one of our friends were like, what? That's weird. I mean, maybe it's just that I've never been that cool. You know what I mean? Maybe that's part of it.
They made it to WQED in Pittsburgh on June 23rd, 2000.
And then his personal secretary came out and like peeked around the corner. She's like, you Morgan and Casey? Like, Fred's waiting for you. He wants to see you.
And then we walk into his office and there's no fanfare, it's just him. And it was great. And he was exactly what you see on television. And said, you must be Morgan and Casey. Come on in, it's great to meet you.
It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor.
He was who you thought he was to an exponential degree.
He said, you drove across country? At first, he couldn't believe it.
At one point, Casey asked Fred Rogers if he could record their conversation.
That was so tough what I went through earlier, I think. You know, it just gives me such great hope to think that the future is in the hands of people like you.
He could see both boys were really good kids.
Fred invited them to explore the neighborhood they'd grown up watching.
Now you see this television house of mine here. It's part of a very big studio, a great big room that's called a television studio.
They talked some more. Casey noticed that when he stammered or stuttered, Fred Rogers didn't finish his sentences for him, didn't rush him, he just waited.
I didn't speak as well then, and even now I get caught sometimes, but he understood that. I think even without me saying it, and was just patient. Fred was better than anybody I've ever met at reading people.
If you need proof of that, consider this. Before the boys left, Mr. Rogers said he had a friend in Seattle he wanted them to meet.
And he said, here's her contact info. And he said, will you give her a call? Will you give Nicole a call when you get back? And we said, yeah, we will.
Nicole Brodeur was a columnist for the Seattle Times. She'd met Fred Rogers a decade before, and they'd remained friends.
So we all become children again. You know, when you're with him, you're a kid, you're vulnerable, you're not a cynic, you're your best self in a way, because he brings that out in you.
The next day, the boys left Pittsburgh happy with hearts full.
He also said, hey, make sure to call when you get home safely, which was so cool.
And when they got back to Seattle, Morgan made a call.
I looked up Nicole in the Seattle Times and, I was like, this is going to be strange, but Fred Rogers wants us to say hello to you. And she's like, we need to talk.
The three of them met and became friends, great friends. Nicole wrote a beautiful column about the whole thing. Fred Rogers kept track from a distance.
What a joy to hear from you yesterday. Thank you for being so generous to Casey and Morgan.
Casey sent Fred Rogers 2 framed pictures, these 2, the one from the Paramount in 1985 and the one from the road trip.
He said, dear Casey, the framed photo of you as a child and of you and me years later is a real treasure.
It was a real friendship. As it turns out, Fred Rogers was only interested in real friendships.
Hello, Casey. This is Fred Rogers in Pittsburgh. I'm sitting here looking at a picture of you when you were very young and when you came to visit us. And just know that we think of you often, and I wish you the very best. Bye-bye, Casey.
Mr. Rogers retired in 2001. He kept the 2 pictures from Casey on an end table in his office till his last day. And 2 years later, in 2003, he died, having touched and taught millions of us about simple, decent kindness. And not least amongst his accomplishments was a certain friendship in Seattle that he'd orchestrated from Pennsylvania.
Welcome to the wedding of
When
Laird
Casey was married, he and Laird, his wife-to-be, asked Nicole to officiate.
Casey and I are story people. We actually met in the course of my writing a story about he and Morgan traveling to meet Mr. Rogers.
He, I think, knew before any of us that the 3 of us were going to be lifelong buddies.
He's my brother, and Fred knew. And it's all because of Fred. So to this day, Fred's long gone, but, we're still here.
He's the kind of guy who does the uncoolest thing ever, travels across the country as a college freshman to meet Mr. Rogers, and somehow turns it into a triumph of the human experience.
Thank you, Fred!
So now you know who Casey McNerthney is. Quite possibly the coolest guy in town.